Well, hi there. So in this video, we're going to take a look at why is demand downward sloping and introduce the concept of elasticity, which just is measuring how much does one variable respond to changes in another. So let's get started. So in this first portion, part one, we're just really talking about two reasons why demand is downward sloping. The first is called the substitution effect. The other is the income effect. And the first idea here is, in kind of technical terms, is that as the price increases for, say, Coke, right, consumers will increase their demand for Pepsi, and that's a substitute. And so they'll decrease their quantity demanded of Coke. And this really should say good X right there, good Z and good X. And it's really saying that good X, or Coca-Cola in this example, that's why the quantity demanded is going to fall, is actually because they're buying more of this good Z. So it's really a notion of saying that as one good gets more expensive, right, we would say that consumers buy something else, And that's the explanation for why they buy less of the first good, right? Of the first good. The second thing here is really only true when we're talking about like the wealth or the purchasing power of the buyers being affected. And so this is mostly for large kind of portions of your income. This one doesn't always really play a huge role in explaining why is it that people don't buy much more, or why they buy less, say, for example, Skittles, right? This one is saying that, when housing gets more expensive or when transportation gets more expensive, as a good gets more expensive, right, they may not necessarily be able to buy something else. Consumers can't afford as much of everything. And conversely, as a good gets cheaper, the consumer can actually afford more of it, right? And so they buy less of the good. So it's really saying that, like, sometimes your wealth or your purchasing power is really being affected by an increase in the price of a good. You may not necessarily be able to swap something out for that, but what you'll often do is you'll just buy a little bit less of that product because it puts the squeeze on your ability to buy other things. Now, the second section in this lecture, is not about why demand is downward sloping. This is really about a concept known as elasticity that we're going to explore in the next couple of lessons. Elasticity, generally speaking, is the measure of responsiveness of two variables. So it's saying how much does this variable respond to a change in this variable. The two variables, the one and the other, that's responding to it, are really in the names of the types of elasticities. And what these elasticities, these different measures, are going to tell us are how much does changing one thing affect another thing, right? Which is a really, really helpful concept, not just limited to economics. But in economics, we're going to look at particularly how much does, say, changing the price affect how much people are willing and able to buy. So kind of a nice transition from the relationship that we were just talking about of, they buy something else or maybe they buy less of it. It's not directly correlated with these two concepts, but I think it's a nice transition. So the first measure of elasticity that we're going to talk about is price elasticity of demand. And I've underlined here the two variables, right? You've got price and you've got quantity demanded. And it's just answering the question of, if we change the price, how much does quantity demanded change? Does it change a whole lot or just a little bit, right? Do people pretty much buy the same amount that they used to? So there is a formula for calculating this, and I'm going to tell you what that formula, the number that it'll spit out, in just a moment, how to interpret that. But really, at a most basic level, we're going to measure the percent change in the quantity demanded of a good, and we're going to divide that by the percent change in the price of that good. And a lot of times students come to me not knowing how to do percent changes, and I tell them, you're going to be screaming and yelling, going, no more percent changes. It's really not that bad. It's new minus the old over the old. And it's just like, no, right? So that's new minus the old value over the old value. That's how we do percent change, just as a quick refresher. And so what this number that it would spit out, right? Percent change over a percent change, the number that it spits out has no units. So that's an important thing to know, right? No units. It's just going to basically give us a value. And so down here, I've given you some interpretations, right? If this value, let's say you had a negative 5% change in quantity in response to a 10% increase in price, that would give you a negative 0.5. We always give these as kind of absolute values, just so we know, right? So these are always an absolute value. And what I'll just say is that, like, if it's less than 1, right, as an absolute value, that means there's not much of a response, right? Now, contrast that with, say, if we change the price 5% and we got a 5% change in quantity, that 5 over 5 is equal to 1. That means it's kind of a proportional 1-to-1 change in price related to change in quantity. If, though, we change the price by 5% and we lost 10% of our quantity, that's a much larger number, right? That's 2. And so that tells us that there's a large response to the change in price. So the number, right, that it's giving us, in this case, 1, or here 0.5, or here is 2. These numbers don't have units, 0.5, 1, 2. They just are something that allows us to interpret kind of how responsive it is. The way that we describe how responsive it is inelastic, elastic. And you can see here there's kind of a range. So if there's no response to a change in price, we call that perfectly inelastic. Think about something that's perfectly inelastic, would never have any bend whatsoever. And so that perfectly inelastic one means you're never going to change the quantity, even if the price changes a whole lot. There are a few goods where that would be true. Maybe not necessarily perfectly inelastic, but they're awfully close. And if we were to graph what that would look like in a little tiny graph of demand, it would actually be a vertical line. Because what this graph tells us is that the quantity that we're buying, and we'll just say that that's like Q star, is going to be the same quantity whether the price is $5 or whether the price is $50. We're going to buy that same quantity. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, does this mean that people would pay an infinite amount of money? No. Remember that demand is actually based on people's willingness and ability to pay. And so this demand curve would run out of values at some maximum level of price. So that's another piece to kind of keep in mind with this. Now, let's take a look at what the other graphs kind of look like with these. If we said that it's relatively inelastic, that means it's got a little bit of a response, but not a whole lot. It's going to be still a little downward sloping, but it's going to be steep. And so this is saying, you know, if the price changed a whole lot, right, you could go up that axis a whole lot, you're not going to get a big change in the quantity, right? So kind of looking at like big change in price, not a big change in the quantity. That would be kind of thinking about things like toilet paper, right? People are going to buy pretty much the same amount of toilet paper as they always do, right? Hopefully, right? Unless you have an issue. But there are certain goods where they're kind of necessity products where that often is true. We'll also kind of look in just a moment about different things that would cause things to have different levels of elasticity. Unit elastic, if this is a 1-to-1 relationship, then it's going to be that kind of traditional looking demand curve that we drew already. And that would be like saying, you know, if the price goes up by that amount, then we're going to see the quantity fall by an equal amount. And so you can kind of test that and see, like, well, if I go up the curve, that's up the price, and I decrease the quantity by an equal amount. Now, relatively elastic goods are ones where as you begin to raise the price or lower the price, you actually get a very large change in response. And so for this one, you could go and change the price just a little bit, right? Just like we just did there, just a little increase in price, and you could lose a lot of your quantity. And so that would be something really important to know, right? If you were a business owner considering maybe changing your prices or updating your price lists, you would want to know if people are going to be really elastic and respond. Perfectly elastic goods are again kind of at the extreme here. They're not going to be ones where we're going to see them very often. But we are going to come back and talk about a perfectly elastic example of it in a next unit. And that would be one where basically any amount of price change causes you to lose all your sales, is actually a way to kind of conceptualize what this means. That if you were to increase your price even by a penny, all your customers walk away and find something else that they want to spend their money on. A hard thing to conceptualize, but I'll give you an example of it later on in this class. Now, some things that cause different levels of elasticities. These are things that, you know, you're not going to get an essay, but probably you'll get a couple of multiple choice questions that'll say, you know, a good has very few substitutes, it's really addictive, and it represents a small share of your income. Is it likely to be inelastic or elastic? And the way I just described that, few substitutes, addictive, and a small share of your income, right, we'll say of your income, then that would be a lower price elasticity of demand. Lower meaning more inelastic. And you can think about why that would be. If there aren't very many substitutes for, say, like a good like insulin, the price of insulin could go from 5 to 50. You would still need to buy Q star amount of it to stay alive, right? Things that are addictive. Cigarettes are really, really addictive. Don't start smoking. You'll never, ever kind of mentally get it out. If you're addicted to cigarettes, we could raise the price, right? In this relatively elastic graph that I have here, and you can see that people would only buy just a few fewer cigarettes, right? Because they're addicted. They're gonna keep coming back for that fix. Income. If it's a really small share of your income, a pack of cigarettes is $7-8 or so, still relatively small share of people's income. They're not going to notice if the price goes up, right? Is really kind of the idea here, that when things are a small share of your income, the price could go up 20%, and you would kind of just continue to buy the same amount, because 20% off of, say, a few dollars is not a whole lot. Necessity versus luxury. Obviously, I was just talking about substitutes. If there's no substitutes for it and it's a necessity, that would make it really, really inelastic. And so that's another one where insulin kind of plays a role. If it's a luxury good, though, you could buy something else, right? So you could imagine relatively elastic would be something like maybe a Caribbean cruise. A Caribbean cruise would have really elastic demand because, well, if the price goes up, you as a person considering a Caribbean cruise, you could just take a different trip somewhere else, right? So there's lots of other options. It's a luxury product. There's tons of substitutes for a Caribbean cruise. I mean, you could take a cruise elsewhere. You could take a different kind of trip. You get the idea. Last is the time window in which to purchase. And so we find that if you give consumers enough time, their demand will become more elastic because they'll become more responsive to changes in price. But in the moment, if they really need to buy the product this moment, then they're going to be pretty inelastic. You think about gasoline. If you're driving home and you're on E, it doesn't matter, like, if the gas station you're passing has just jacked up the prices a whole lot, you're going to have to fill up with gas. But if I told you that 5 to 10 years from now, gas was going to be $10 a gallon, then you're going to have time in that 5 to 10 windows where you could make some changes in your life. And then you're going to have a much more elastic demand for gasoline over a really long period of time. Again, not really an essay question for these, but they are something that you're going to see some multiple choice questions about. You'll also see questions about kind of interpreting these values of, what does it mean when the elasticity value is really big versus close to zero? And you'll get questions that'll give you some numbers that'll ask you to figure out actually that elasticity value, percent change quantity demanded over percent change in price. One tip, and this will be kind of the last thing I'll say to you, is that usually prices are in dollars in this class, and the dollar values are always going to go in the denominator for these particular calculations. So when we come back and we do more elasticities, I'm going to mention that again. You put the quantity in the numerator and the dollars in the denominator. So hopefully this helped you understanding demand and elasticity. I'll see you next time.